really don't want to do this, so let's do it. Prelude to Ulysses. Alex reads Ancient Evenings. Now we're on to part 3 of this lovely book, where seems like Minnie too is passing on to Kurt Nerder, whatever that means. I don't remember. It's called The Book of the Child. We'll probably split this up into 2 sections. Part 1. Our way brought us back to the Pyramid of Khufu. It was hard to pretend I felt calm. My fear of all that was yet to come now lay on me like a slab of stone. And the sight of the Great Pyramid did not reduce my turmoil. With each of Menenhetit's steps, I felt more woe, for he walked ahead of me with the quick pace of someone trying to escape a bad odor. And I remembered the grave robber who fled as I approached the door to my tomb. He had loathed my breath even as I had detested his. A sign the wretch was in another realm than my own. But if this was true, what conclusion should I draw about Menenhetit and myself? Could he be my Kaibit? That was a thought to leave its echo. My shadow, Khaibit. Who could be more at odds than the Kaibit and the Ka? The Ka might be one's last poor means of continuing to exist. I think I've misunderstood it for a minute. But could not bear the weight of much memory. The Kaibit, however, knew all that had happened to you, so it could distort what the Ka did remember. An instrument for evil. This conviction that Menenhetit was my shadow came on me with such force that I was about to ask, "Are you the Kaibit of Menenhetit too?" But did not, from the fear that he would only confuse me further by such remark as, "No, you are the Ka of Menenhetit I, and I am the Kaibit." So I did not speak, and only continued to travel behind him at his quick rate. It must be said that he moved like my guide, his white robe wrapped around him in disdain for casual contact with beggars or bats. Yes, everything in his posture spoke of a servant who leads his guest and will not suffer any distracting encounter. Even as we emerged from the necropolis, a man was standing at the gate with his palm open, a beggar's palm with no fingers. Not missing a stride, Menenhetit struck him a sharp slap on the arm to make it clear no approach would be tolerated. Indeed, the man flinched as we passed, and I realized we must look like a noble to him. But then I had not contemplated my clothes until now. When had I first come to wear these clean white pleats, this jeweled breastplate? A memory returned of promenade taken by the banks of the Nile, and multitudes bowing before me. The picture was so clear as for me to believe it. A memory returned of a promenade taken by the banks of the Nile, and multitudes bowing before me. The picture was so clear as for me to believe it, and my pleasure was not unlike the satisfaction I had just known before the respect of the beggar. Warmed by such tokens, my mood took a great turn for the worse, however, so soon as I began to ponder my great-grandfather's remarks about Horus and Set, for I had to suppose that Menenhetit, given the occasion, would try to put no fine word on it, to bugger me. The quiet arrogance of the old man that he could bring off such a feat was curious. I did not know whether to think of him as laughable. After all, the muscles of my hips spoke of pride. Nothing was broken in my back. Even as we walked, I felt quietly in my arms and legs and was reassured. My means might be 1/7 of what it had been. But I still did not see how that foul old man could be the first to take carnal ownership of me. I was remembering how my friends and myself used to think ourselves as virgin to other men until some fellow was brave enough to grab us from the rear. Of course, once your body was broken into by another, that was a true turning. An aristocrat would allow himself to be used in such a way, but once as if truth, we had one royal flower to offer. Aww. We were determined that no one we did not admire in every way could even begin our seduction. Some of us went on in such chastity for years. That could become a vice. One might grow into a spinster who has waited too long and is so vulnerable to any passing lout. The balance of Mott is in the choice. BFing is a pretty big deal in ancient Egypt. It's important. It's a part of their culture. Anal. Now I wondered if it's fine. I ain't judging. I'm just saying. Now I wondered if I had been one of those who had waited too long. What a horror if Menenhedet I became the first. No, not conceivable, I thought, as I watched him walk before me in a flapping old man's step, his head covered in a chill, although it was a warm night. Nonetheless, he did not move altogether like an old man. I was uneasy. We were now near the foot of the pyramid of Khufu, and as though my reluctance to go on was evident, Menenhedet came to rest and began to speak again, although I could hardly listen. His breath was so mingled with mine, I do not know what he sniffed in my throat, but I thought I had stepped into the scalding odor of urine. It was like a cave of bats, a fair guide to the corruptions of the duad. Yet in the act of suffering his fumes, I was so was I delivered of the worst of them. His breath was now endurable, and not much worse than old garlic and old teeth. The common entrance to the duad, he said, as he shivered in the warm moonlight. It's far beyond the first cataract. A long journey, and not the route for us. We will go in by way of cave that can be found in the sky. I would never have understood this last remark if the pyramid had not been there before us. But in the moonlight, these limestone slopes were gleaming bright as marble, and their shadows looked dark as velvet. I remember the chamber of Khufu in the center of this great pyramid. Was that a cave in the sky by which I had once been ready to enter the duad? All by myself? Had I taken the wrong turning? But I had no taste for such questions. Menenhedet was speaking, meanwhile, about matters so trivial I hardly listened. It was something about a Hebrew slave he had kept, and curious customs among the Hebrews. They are demented, said Menenhedet, and happy to remain shepherds. They do best when talking to themselves in the hills. I relate. Nonetheless, I have observed that barbaric people, like beasts, live closer than we do to their gods. As an example, he said, and in truth, his voice was calming the weakness of my body. I remember the odd language of this Hebrew slave. At first I thought it was a dialect spoken by an imbecile, since he did not seem to have any notion of yesterday or tomorrow in anything he said. I like that. Yet he must have 100 words for cut, and used one for slicing reeds, another for meat or fowl, and separate kinds of fruit. Not to speak of chopping down a tree or cutting off a hand. Not stupid at all when you think everything that we cut has its spirit severed most abruptly. A good word does well to propitate. All right, we'll look that one up. Propitiate, propitiata. Propitiate, to make favorably inclined, appease, conciliate. Tried to propitiate angry gods. Okay. A good man does well to propitiate the pain. No, we would not, mused Menenhedet. Okay, I didn't really get any clearer anywhere. Mused Menenhedet. No, we would not, mused Menenhedet. Wish to dispatch each of our enemies with the same cry. So the varieties of these words led me to study that shepherd's language, and I began to see enigmas in his tongue. The Hebrews, I discovered, live with what is before them at the very instant. Their words reflect a simple condition. I eat, they say, simple. But when they wish to speak of what is not before them now, why then you cannot tell, unless you know the trick of the language, whether they are speaking of what is past or what is yet to come. It seems the same in the way they say it. They tell you, for example, I ate, and you won't know whether they have just finished a meal or they are going to eat in a while. Not unless you listen so carefully as to realizing. They actually said, and I ate. That means they will eat. They know how peculiar time can be. And on their thick tongues, conceive of it. How can we be certain that what we say we will do tomorrow has not in truth taken place yesterday? Although we cannot quite remember it since it was in a dream. So do not. Said Menenhedet, touching me gently by the shoulder. So do not feel too weak before what is to come. It could have happened to you already. Yes, dear son of my dear granddaughter, Hathfertiti. Your terror may have more dignity than you know. It may belong to the remorse of your past rather than tell you of some unendurable torture to come. It might belong to the remorse of your past rather than tell you of some unendurable torture to come. So a confusion over time in the afterlife. Pretty interesting, pretty fun. Yeah, it's a long one, kind of. Then indeed I felt relief. His long speech had managed to calm me, and again I felt something like good feeling for the old man at this unexpected turn of kindness. Now as the moon passed over the peak of the pyramid of Khufu, Menenhedet raised his hand delicately, and I gasped at the beauty of that white light which came down upon us from the triangular slope. Menenhedet spoke in the quietest voice, as if the smallest quiver of his throat might distort the purity of the light. This divine pyramid, he whispered, is the exact equal of the first hill that Temu brought up from the celestial waters. So it is the tomb to contain all other tombs by entry into this pyramid. You will descend into the currents of the Duat. And as I looked at the great slope before us, smooth as a sheet of papyrus in the moonlight, and large to my eyes as the expanses of the desert, so did I wonder how we might ever enter. The joinings of each great block of limestone must be narrower than the space of 2 fingers when squeezed together. But I had not long to wait. Menenhedet walked the last 100 steps to the base, and there he threw back his head and uttered a cry I had never heard before. Not the long warble of a bird, nor any mysterious grunt of a beast, but a voice as shrill in its center as the piping of a bat, and a slab of stone on the slope above us revolved in its socket like a door. Yum! It is time, he said to me, and began with surprising nimbleness to mount the slope. I followed, expecting my breath to be locked with anguish, yet I felt no fear. But then a child knows less awe before the rising of the sun than does a man. Was I entering at the moment when death could feel most natural to me? I know that as we went through the opening of the pyramid, a change came upon the air. If I had been blind, my ears would have told me that I was passing into another domain. I listened to a delicate silence, close to the unheard quivering of a small bird's wings. The hush of every temple was in the weight of the silence, and the lost echo of each animal sacrificed on the altar stone. I knew again the haze that rises from the dying beast, the drip of its blood bringing peace to the same air that has just been stricken by the murder of the animal. If we had wounded the stone by our entrance, the echo of our footsteps in these vaults would quiet all disorder. If we had wounded the stone by our entrance, I'm assuming psychic wound, the echo of our footsteps in this vault would quiet all disorder because they even everything out. I don't know. Down we went along a promenade in the dark, down some low tunnel that made us stoop, and before us was the scuttling of rats and a scattering of insects, while bats flew so near that I all but heard the menace of their brain. Pour myself some coffee real quick, and we'll go through what's going on so far. So, homeboy, Menenhedit, has told him the story of his people, which was kind of weird, and has taken him to the Kurt Nurter, which I think is the first entryway to the afterlife, to the real afterlife. And, he was pretty concerned that his great-grandpa would bang him, because he just seems like that kind of guy. But then his grandpa starts telling him about the language of one of his slaves and how the past, present, and future tenses were confusing. And perhaps that's because that is the nature of things, to be unsure of time, especially in dreams or afterlife or, fantasies or whatever. It's hard to keep track of what has happened and what will happen, especially in a state of death. I lost my page. And so they're trying to get to the Duat, which I think is just a river of poo-poo. Trying to get there. So he can start moving on. But he's liking his grandpa more, which is nice. Definitely a confusing guy at first. And there's a bunch of bugs, and there's life in here, that's for sure. I wonder if this tea is going to have a bad effect. Yeah. Could definitely taste the rose hips in that coffee. Let's continue. Yet these disturbances also ceased. There came as we walked a sense of heavy calm as the oily swell of the Nile on the flood, and I began to have an expectation of a larger space opening before me. House of Leaves, and indeed, in the next 10 steps, we entered a tall and narrow gallery. By the piping of the bats, I suppose its ceiling must have been 30 feet above, and the galley was dark. All the same, I could feel light about me. I did not see a thing, but the interior of my mind was so full of night, I could recall how, on a given day in my childhood, I had passed once down the Nile, with my parents, in a barge under the sky of sunlight, so brilliant that my thoughts felt exposed to the sun. As if all of me was in a golden barge afloat in golden light. My father and mother were taking me to visit the pharaoh, and I was so alive with the pleasure of my limbs that I even remember the color of saffron on the gown I wore. On that morning there would be sights to disrupt the eye and savage your nose. The corpse of a dog was rotting on the riverbank, but the day was begun in splendor, and each push of the boatman's pole restored my calm, even as the sounds of our steps in the tunnel now overcame the rustling. I got my tenses mixed up. Overcame the rustling of the insects and the bats. At this moment, Menenhedit took my hand, and I noticed that my great-grandfather's breath was perfumed. The air he exhaled from his lungs must share the intoxication of my interior light. Some of the calm of that morning remained in the warmth of his palm, as if we were sharing the loyalty of family flesh. But soon, given the narrowness of the passage, which made walking side by side awkward, he had to withdraw his hand. As I went on in this darkness, bathed in light behind my eyes, I seemed to pass through veils of heat and cold, the air collecting in chill pods like the void of a tomb. Yet another 5 steps, and I was back in the balmy Egyptian night, breathing the warm perfume I had first taken in on my great grandfather's breath. Oh, yeah. A scent that did not seem to come from him so much as from the stone itself. Until I began to feel as if we were not on our way up a steep, narrow ramp, so much as winding our passage from tent to tent of a mysterious bazaar. And in each tent lived a presence pure to itself. One had only to offer attention. And into one's thoughts wisdom would seep as naturally as the infusion of an herb in water, and will set free its essence. Within the intoxication of this light, and the gatherings of aroma, I began to feel as if I did not move with my body, but glided along in a bark. I don't know what that means. I could still reach out an arm on either side, and the walls of the gallery were still there to touch. Yet I felt closer to the Nile on that one golden day I could remember of my boyhood. Or rather, as if much confused, like the Hebrew who could not separate what was about to come from all that he might dream. Excuse me. I felt as if the river was washing along the shore, and the walls were riverbanks, and I was on the Nile once more. Even as on that day of brilliant sunlight, I had rested on cushions of a yellow cloth brighter than the saffron of my garment. A silver filigree. Okay. Filigree. Delicate ornamental work of fine silver, gold, or other metal wires, especially lacy jewelers' work of scrolls and arabesques. Anything very delicate or fanciful, or composed of or resembling filigree, or to adorn with or form into a filigree. So fancy shit. Okay, cool. The silver fancy shit in the cushion still tickled intimately against my seat, so that, unseen by my parents, I was trying to rub the tender skin of my cheeks against those tendrils of silver thread, a sweet pleasure, for I was no more than 6. My parents were speaking. That they said that they left their lips with many a twist. What they said left their lips with many a twist. Now, since now I remember how deceitful they were often to one another. Hard. Since now I remember how deceitful they were often to one another. They often were to another. I would have written it. And the curve of their words must have traveled with us on the serpentine of the Nile, a washing golden light upon the brown waters of the river, and we passed by green and mud-gold banks. Even the gold inlay on the silver wood of the fine seats of our barge still journeyed with me. In the curve of their words, and my mother was speaking. I remember of a sacred bull, and I was hearing her voice even now as I stood with my hands on the wall of this stone gallery, as near to me as a palm tree one could reach on the bank. And her voice was no ordinary voice, but full of the command of every sensuous instinct. Deep as the voice of a man, but full of tender and mysterious resonance. She had only to hum a note with that voice, say no more than the crook and the fail of the pharaoh Ptah-nem-hotep. And my belly felt as dusky as the colors of a dark rose. My father replied to what she had said. Speech between himself and my mother was not their common practice, and they were now together for excellent but separate reasons. They were each paying a call on the same Ptah-nem-hotep, our own Ramses IX. My father on a trip that took place nearly every day, and my mother on a rare visit, although I did not know, as I thought of it now, why she did not, given her beauty, visit the pharaoh more often. But the cynicism of this thought, so far from the understanding of a boy of 6, proved enough to dispel the memory. My mind was brought back to our ascent up the gallery, and I ceased to live on that morning, and no longer floated within it. I got what he needed from it. So as a child, he was just not unsure of what was going on with his parents, and now with hindsight, he has a better understanding, and it no longer is important. All I need to know is that he was once stupid. It's my take. Was once um, had less information. Menenhetit now led me to an alcove by one of the walls. Since I still felt in some measure the sensation of being on a boat, it was not unlike floating into a harbor on a dark night. The presence of light in my body was certainly gone. Then I gave an exclamation. In front of me was water at the level of my waist. I could see a star within the water. Had the floor become my sky? I felt a clear thrill as if I was falling into the depths, yet would never smash. The thrill ceased, and I realized I was looking into a large bowl of water. And the star was a reflection. The heavens were beyond, still beyond. Menenhetit had led me to a place in the pyramid where a shaft came down to us at a sharp angle from the sky. When I now peered upward, I could see the star in the aperture of the top. Even as I looked, it moved away from the center. In the interval I had studied it, the star had traveled enough to shift its position a palm's width in the water. How remarkable that Menenhetit could lead me to the reflection at the instant its light lived in the center of the bowl. That star has not been seen in this place for 372 years, he told me now. We have a night for wonders between us all. And for some reason this pious thought put a stimulation on my loins, and a curl of the happiest anticipation commenced at the root of my spine and curled upward like incense. An incantation came to me, from where I do not know. But I said aloud, the Pharaoh takes the son of his beloved, and he plants therewith by the light of the sun. Hi, baby dog. Yeah. What grows from the earth, I heard myself say, is the blessed plant of papyrus, and beneath the hands of men it becomes a field for scribes, as they plant their messages on this field. All the plants of papyrus dwell in the clamor of all of the writings that will ride upon that field like chariots. Yet the field remembers a river bank, and every bud is like the lips of a mouth, and every leaf is a tongue of honey. I saw the Nile again, and the heats were rising off the indolence of the river. This incantation, out of the impulses as curious as I had ever known, for I had never heard the words before, produced a power sufficient to draw back into me the golden light of the Nile. Then I said, papyrus is a plant abhorred by crocodiles, and had one moment of childish joy merry, as the desires long ago to sprinkle flowers with the golden waters of my urine, as clear as that day. I also saw the flutter of a tiny spur wing as she nibbled at river worms embedded in the mouth of a crocodile. Yes, saw that armored beast on the muddy banks, its mouth open in good-humored languor. Languor? Okay, fine. Languor is a noun. Lack of energy or vitality, sluggishness. It's not a noun. Lack of spirit or interest, listlessness, stagnation. Languor. That's my favorite word today. Its mouth open in good-humored languor at the cleaning of its teeth by the spurwing. An improbable couple, but domesticity was the fanning of her wings in the sleepy gaunts of the great lizard. Some boatmen were singing on the Nile, "Oh, papyrus is a plant abhorred by crocodiles," and nodded as they rowed upstream. Our boatmen, reduced by the heat to no more than a breechcloth to cover the purse of their penis and testicles, perched against the long poles, guided us downstream. When did they end up here? He just spoke the words, and now he's being rowed upstream. Our boatmen, reduced to whatever, guided us downstream. Oh, so they were past. Okay, so wait. And the marvelous tickling of the skin of my seat began again. and I in turn pushed against the silver filigree of my cushion. Oh, he's back as a kid. Mud, said my mother, then is in my nostrils and my pores. Said my mother then, is in my nostrils and my pores. And she turned the fine curve of her nostril to the sight of a chariot, a horse and a rider galloping in the heat of the day and in the dust of the road beside the river bank. And I had then, as a child of 6, even while full of delight at the passing of the charioteer, a clear glimpse forward into myself at 21, as if I was not the only child, but could see the life I was yet to live. He is getting lost in time. I love this. The charioteer is himself. As I stared at that star which hovered in the mirror of the water, the sentiment became so real that the past came back to me as if I were truly 6, and yet could see myself at 21, as I was again with the priest at his sister's house. That priest at his sister's house, the one that they both had sex with each other, I think, and saw a view of the Nile from her window, and heard the sounds of the water stroking the bank, even as the body of the priest gave intense slaps against her flesh. Man, I, next to Menenhedet, looking down through the darkness at the star, was overcome with the force of 2 such memories, myself at 6, myself at 21, and felt faint. It was then that my great-grandfather took my hand again, a vine grew foliage in my belly, curled along my limbs, and flowed out of my hand into the knuckles and thumb of Menenhedet. And my mind turned back into that gilded barge that drew my mother, my father, and myself down the Nile, so that I understood at last why our Egyptian word for the eye is most certainly the same as our word for love, and both are identical to our word for tomb, whether love or the depth of mood which arose from such a tomb. The sensation that came from his fingers was certainly carrying me along the river, and belonged more to the brilliance of that long-departed day than to this niche of a pitch-black gallery in the depths of the Pyramid of Khufu. Then, with a twist to my memory as simple as pulling a lemon from a tree, so did I discover that Menenhedet was on the barge, and that was most certainly at odds with what I could remember. Yet I had only to give up the feeling. It was no longer a certainty that Menenhedet had died in the year before I was born. And he was, yes, on the boat, and speaking to my mother. If I had seen the barge at first with my father and mother next to me, and with clarity more vivid than a temple painting, now I saw Menenhedet as well. He, too, sat beside me, and his hair showed the silver of a virile maturity, while the lines of his face had not yet become a myriad of wrinkles, terraces, and webs, but exhibited, instead, the look of character supported by triumph, which comes to powerful men when they are 60 and still strong. So they've crawled into the pyramid, and he is walking down a hole that has opened up in the side of the pyramid of Khufu, and he is basically walking through memories of cold and hot, maybe lives, cold and hot, and deaths, cold and hot, and keeps being brought back to this memory of riding down the Nile with his mother and father, who seem to hate each other, but have come together for this journey. And you can't keep track of whether he's there or whether he's there, and then or whether he's still in the pyramid. Now, Menenhedet has led him to a bowl of water with a single star that he can see in the very center of the bowl. It has taken almost 400 years for the star to return back to this part of the bowl. It just so happens that he's there at that moment. And he keeps returning to this memory of the Nile, which he has such a fond memory of. It was beautiful. Everything was colorful. He had both of his family members there. You know, it's a memorable moment. And he also sees himself as a 21-year-old going up the river, perhaps, or maybe as a charioteer. No, yes, just a glimpse of himself at 21. But he keeps returning back to this old memory, and now he returns back, and Menenhetit, who had died the year before of his birth, 7 years previous to this memory, is now there. Now, at first, his brain wants to say, fuck that, that's not real. But he gives into the illusion. He gives into it. And he believes he's there now. Who's talking to his mom? His daughter. His great-granddaughter, right? Maybe his daughter. Great-granddaughter. Yet to see him with us was to give me as well some confusion. Yet to see him with us was to give me as well some confusion as to where we were on the river. I knew we were on our way to visit the Pharaoh, but now I could not understand why we did not travel up the river when my parents' villa had its grounds located a long walk downstream from the palace. Now we are going with the current, no sails set and no oarsmen at work, perhaps a different memory. There was only the boatman we called Stinking Body at the bow with his long pole to fend us off the bars, and his head on backwards, which is a name, at the helm. That head on backwards was also called Eater of Shadows, for whenever we sailed upstream to the south, the tiller was in the shade of a sail. But now we were drifting down into the brunt of that prevailing breeze that came out of the delta, a wind strong enough to let us sail without oars upstream against the current. Today, however, we drifted down lazily, knee-ha-how in the bow, and Unum Kaibitu, the Eater of Shadows, in the stern. So Stinking Body is Neha-how, Neha-HAU, and Unum Kaibitu is head on backwards, or Eater of Shadows. This paragraph took a turn. In the stern. While the rest of the crew, Bone Smasher, White Teeth, Eater of Blood, and he of the nose, a tremendous nose, were lolling against the gunwales. An easy day for them, so he has now gone into some other realm. I was thinking that the boatmen had ugly faces when at rest. If obliged to row upstream under the worst of conditions, when the river was in flood and they were working too hard to sing in unison, then the sound of their breath came close to the anguish of weeping, and they had the maniacal expression of horses in a frightened gallop. Such an intensity of expression, such torture in the effort, that they could not be wholly ugly. At rest, however, their faces looked unusually swollen. Nobody knew why rivermen when ashore were always in more fights than any other kind of laborer in Memphis, unless it was that they drank more beer, which was true. I love coffee so much. They drank more beer, which was true, but most of them had faces which looked as if a lion had been chewing on their cheeks. Lions in Egypt? I don't know. Probably, maybe. Besides, there was the whip that was forever laying the welt of new scars over the old ones on their shoulders. Now and again it flicked around their neck to reach their face. As a result, half of the boatmen were blind in an eye. If blinded in both, they went to other labor. Set Kesu, the head boatman, was not named Bone Smasher for too little, was the one to apply the whip. When the winds were strong, my great-grandfather would on occasion take the lash. Okay, so he's now gone into Amenhotep's memory. He could make the tip dance, crack it around a man's waist, and flick his navel. Or if an oarsman ever, that's called a reach around. No, let's take that joke out. Edit it. We don't need jokes in this one. Huh? Or, if an oarsman ever stopped to scratch himself, sting the boatman's armpit with such precision that a few hairs would fly off. Unfortunately, there was every reason to scratch. Where was the boatman without his lice? Okay, we'll stop there. I very likely need to get to work. Well, I'm a bit confused with what's occurring right now. So that there was no oarsman, no one was there, and then all of a sudden there was somebody. Well, let's try to figure that out before we move on forever. So. Oh, no oarsmen at work. Okay. So these are all people that worked on their boat frequently and were constantly being tortured in front of them. And he's having a pleasant memory about it. And he has memories of his great-grandfather somehow being real good at the whip, being able to smash some pubes off of fucking someone 20 feet away. Fun. So, part 1A, what we'll call that. We'll be back with part 1B some other day.